It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in the small, sleepy town. The kind of place where nothing ever happens, where the most exciting part of the day might be a neighbor's dog barking at a passing squirrel. But on this particular night, that same barking dog became the start of something no one could have predicted. The dog, an old golden retriever named Max, was loved by everyone in the neighborhood. He had a knack for sensing when something wasn't quite right, and tonight, he wouldn't stop barking. Not at squirrels, not at passing cars, but at something far stranger. Max had led his owners, a young couple named Sarah and Jake, to an overgrown corner of their backyard, where a patch of earth looked disturbed. At first, they thought it might be a buried toy or maybe a raccoon hiding out, but Max's frantic digging told a different story. Sarah grabbed a flashlight while Jake tried to calm Max down. The beam of light swept across the uneven ground, and that's when they saw it, a weathered, wooden edge sticking out of the dirt. It was a box, no larger than a suitcase, with strange carvings etched into the surface. At this point, most people would have stopped, called the authorities maybe, but curiosity has a way of pulling you in when you least expect it, and the couple decided they had to see what was inside. With Max whining and pacing nervously, Jake grabbed a small shovel and started to dig. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just some forgotten storage chest. It was a coffin, an old, weathered coffin, hidden right beneath their feet for who knows how long. By now, Sarah's heart was racing. "Do you think this could be?" she started to ask, but the words caught in her throat. Jake didn't answer. He was too focused on the task at hand, his fingers trembling as he brushed dirt away from the lid. The carvings on the coffin were intricate, but strange, symbols neither of them recognized. And then there was Max. The dog, who had always been brave and calm, was now trembling, letting out low, uneasy growls as he backed away from the scene. It was almost as if he sensed something they couldn't. Sarah glanced at Jake nervously. "Maybe we should wait. Call someone," she said, but Jake shook his head. "We've come this far," he replied. "We need to know what's inside." With one final tug, the lid came loose. The hinges groaned, echoing through the night like some eerie soundtrack to a horror film. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and what they found inside left them speechless. There, lying perfectly preserved despite the passage of time, was, inside the coffin lay something that defied explanation. It wasn't a body, as Sarah and Jake had feared, or perhaps expected. Instead, nestled in the worn interior was a bundle wrapped in what looked like aged, darkened cloth. The fabric had an almost oily sheen to it, as though it had been soaked in something over the years. A faint metallic scent wafted from it, making Sarah wrinkle her nose. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just stared. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Jake reached out cautiously, his hand hovering over the strange bundle. "I don't know," he murmured, his curiosity outweighing his growing sense of dread. Max let out a sharp bark behind them, startling them both. The dog was pacing furiously now, his movements quick and erratic, as if he wanted nothing more than to get as far away from the coffin as possible. "Jake, stop," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "This feels wrong. We shouldn't even be touching this thing." Jake hesitated, glancing between her and the bundle. "We can't just leave it like this," he said, his voice low but firm. "What if it's important? What if someone buried it here for a reason?" Sarah wanted to argue, but a part of her was just as curious. What was this thing, and why had Max been so desperate to find it? Against her better judgment, she let go of Jake's arm and stepped back. With slow, deliberate movements, Jake lifted the bundle out of the coffin. It was heavier than it looked, and as he placed it gently on the ground, they could both hear something shifting inside. A soft clinking noise, like glass or metal, came from within the folds of fabric. Jake and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, their breath visible in the cold night air. "Let's open it," Jake said, his voice steady but tense. Sarah hesitated again, but her curiosity had reached a tipping point. She crouched beside Jake, and together they began to unwrap the bundle. Layer by layer, the fabric revealed more of its contents. At first, it seemed like nothing but old, dusty material. But then, something glimmered in the moonlight, a small, ornate box made of silver, tarnished and scratched with age. It was covered in the same strange symbols as the coffin, and its latch was sealed tightly. "What do you think's inside?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jake said, running his fingers over the box's surface. "But whatever it is, someone went through a lot of trouble to keep it hidden." Sarah glanced around nervously. The night suddenly felt darker, the silence heavier. "What if we're not supposed to find this?" she said, her words laced with unease. "What if it's dangerous?" Jake didn't answer. He was too focused on the box, his fingers searching for a way to open it. As he fiddled with the latch, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows around them seemed to shift and stretch, and every small sound made her jump. Even Max, usually so brave, had retreated to the porch, his eyes fixed on the scene with a look of pure unease. Finally, with a soft click, the latch gave way. Jake paused, looking up at Sarah as if to say, "Are you ready for this?" She nodded, though her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. He lifted the lid. Inside the silver box was something unexpected, a collection of small, delicate objects. There was a pocket watch, its face cracked but still faintly ticking. Beside it lay a ring with a deep red gemstone, and a photograph, black and white, faded with time. The photo showed a young woman, her expression somber, standing in front of what looked like an old farmhouse. Behind her, barely visible, was the silhouette of a man standing in the shadows. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, picking up the photo carefully. Jake shook his head. "I have no idea, but this feels personal." Sarah studied the woman's face, trying to imagine who she might have been and what her connection to all of this could be. "Do you think this is some kind of keepsake box? Like, someone buried it here to remember them?" "Maybe," Jake said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. His eyes were drawn to the pocket watch, its faint ticking strangely hypnotic. But why bury it in a coffin? And why all the symbols? As they examined the items, a strange feeling settled over them. It wasn't fear exactly, but a heavy sense of unease, like they had stumbled onto something they weren't meant to find. Sarah couldn't shake the thought that there was more to this story, something hidden just out of reach. "Jake," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, "I think we should put it back. All of it. Whatever this is, it's not ours to take." Jake hesitated, torn between his curiosity and the growing weight of Sarah's concern. "Maybe you're right," he said, though he sounded reluctant. "But don't you want to know more? Who these people were? Why this is here?" "Of course I do," Sarah said. "But not like this. Not in the middle of the night, with Max acting like he's seen a ghost." As if on cue, Max let out another sharp bark, his body tense and his ears pinned back. Sarah's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. She could feel it. "Okay," Jake said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his hands. "Let's put it back. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Together, they began to rewrap the bundle, their movements quick and uneasy. But as they placed it back into the coffin and started to lower the lid, a sudden noise froze them in their tracks. It was faint at first, like the sound of distant footsteps crunching on gravel. But it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo all around them. Sarah's heart raced as she turned to Jake, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Someone's here," he said, his voice barely audible. They both turned toward the shadows, their eyes straining to see what was out there. But the darkness revealed nothing, just the faint rustling of leaves and the steady thrum of their own racing hearts. "Let's go," Jake said finally, his voice firm. "Now." Sarah didn't argue. Grabbing Max's leash, she and Jake hurried back toward the house, leaving the coffin half buried in the ground. As they stepped onto the porch, Sarah glanced back one last time. The backyard was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew better. Whatever they had uncovered that night wasn't just an old, forgotten secret. It was something far stranger and far more dangerous. And though they didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The rest of the night was restless for Sarah and Jake. They had managed to bury the coffin again, but neither of them could shake the feeling that they had disturbed something that was better left alone. Every creak of the house and rustle of wind outside made Sarah jump, and Max refused to leave her side, his usual playful demeanor replaced with anxious pacing. Jake sat by the kitchen table, staring at the photograph they'd taken from the silver box, the expression on his face unreadable. "Jake, you're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Sarah asked softly, sitting down across from him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he drummed his fingers against the table. "How can I not?" he replied, his voice low. "That woman in the picture. There's something about her. I feel like I've seen her before." Sarah frowned. "How would you have seen her? That photo has to be decades old. Maybe more." "I don't know," Jake said, shaking his head. "But the way she's looking at the camera, it's like she's trying to say something. Like she wants us to know something." Sarah leaned in, studying the photograph again. The woman's face was haunting in its stillness, her eyes sharp and intense, even in black and white. Behind her, the shadowy figure of the man lingered, his features too blurred to make out. "What about the guy in the background?" Sarah asked. "Do you think he has something to do with all this?" Jake shrugged, but before he could answer, Max let out a low growl from his spot near the door. Both of them turned toward the sound, their nerves on edge. The dog was staring intently out the window, his ears pinned back. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, standing up. He walked over to the window and peered outside, but the backyard was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered, but the unease in his voice was clear. Sarah didn't believe it was just a raccoon. The air felt too heavy, too still. She hugged her arms around herself, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. "Maybe we should call someone," she said. "The police or, I don't know, a historian or something. Someone who can tell us what those symbols mean." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe, but I don't think this is the kind of thing the police are going to care about. And I'm not sure a historian would know what to make of it either." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice rising slightly. "We can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine. Something's wrong, Jake. You feel it too, don't you?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Of course I feel it, but I don't know what to do about it." He paused, glancing down at the photograph again. "Maybe we can start with this. Try to figure out who she is. If we can figure that out, maybe we can make sense of the rest." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she said, "but we do this together. No digging around on your own. No messing with that coffin again. Promise me?" Jake looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "I promise," he said. The next day, they started their search. Jake scanned the photograph into his computer, hoping to use online tools to identify the woman, while Sarah combed through local archives and news articles. The small town had a long history, and the land their house was built on had been around for over a century. It wasn't long before Sarah stumbled onto something that sent chills down her spine. An old newspaper article, dated nearly 80 years ago, told the story of a missing woman named Evelyn Hart. The grainy photo in the article was unmistakable. It was the same woman from their photograph. According to the article, Evelyn had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town. "Jake, you need to see this," Sarah said, pulling him over to her laptop. He read the article, his expression darkening with every word. "She lived nearby," Sarah continued. "That farmhouse in the background of the photo. It's only a few miles from here. What if she's connected to the coffin? What if she's the one who buried it?" Jake finished, his voice quiet. Sarah nodded. "Or maybe she's the reason it's buried. What if someone buried it to hide something about her? Or to keep something from being found?" Jake sat back, the gears in his mind turning. "There's only one way to find out," he said finally. "We need to see that farmhouse." Sarah hesitated. The thought of going out there, to a place tied to so much mystery and unease, sent a shiver down her spine. But she couldn't deny that they were onto something. "Fine," she said, "but we go during the day, and we take Max." The next morning, the three of them set out for the farmhouse. It was a bright, sunny day, but the closer they got, the more the air seemed to change. The farmhouse, long abandoned, stood at the edge of a wooded area, its weathered boards and broken windows giving it an eerie, forgotten look. Max's ears perked up as they approached, but instead of barking, he let out a low whine. Sarah glanced down at him, her unease growing. "Let's make this quick," she said, gripping Jake's arm. They stepped onto the creaking porch, the wood groaning under their weight. The front door was slightly ajar, and Jake pushed it open with a soft creak. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. Old furniture lay scattered and broken, and faded wallpaper peeled from the walls. As they moved through the house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of her vision, and every creak of the floorboards sounded too loud, too deliberate. In one of the upstairs rooms, they found something that stopped them cold. Scrawled across the walls in faded, uneven handwriting were the same strange symbols that had been carved into the coffin and the silver box. "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something else, a small, dusty book lying open on the floor. He picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. It was filled with more of the strange symbols, along with notes and sketches that seemed to depict rituals, instructions, warnings. This isn't just some random thing," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is deliberate. Someone was trying to do something here." Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the symbols on the wall. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling, "I think we need to leave. Now." Jake nodded, clutching the book tightly. But as they turned to go, Max let out a loud, frantic bark. The sound echoed through the empty house, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, a sound answered. A low, guttural noise that sent chills down their spines. They didn't wait to find out what it was. Grabbing Max's leash, they bolted from the house, their footsteps pounding against the creaking floorboards. But as they ran, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following them. By the time they made it back to the car, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. As they sped away, the farmhouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the sense of unease stayed with them, clinging to them like a shadow. They had gone looking for answers, but all they had found were more questions, and a growing sense that whatever they had uncovered was far from over. The drive home was silent, except for the occasional whimper from Max in the back seat. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the distance. Jake sat with the old book clutched in his lap, his knuckles white as he stared out the window. Neither of them said anything, but the tension in the car was thick, their unspoken fears filling the air. When they got home, the house felt different. The warm, familiar space now seemed foreign, like the shadows in the corners had grown darker and the creaks in the floorboards more deliberate. Max hesitated at the door, his tail low, before darting inside and retreating to his usual spot under the kitchen table. Sarah locked the door behind them, double-checking it before turning to Jake. "What are we even doing, Jake?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "We shouldn't have gone there. We shouldn't have taken anything. It feels like we've brought something back with us." Jake didn't respond right away. He placed the book on the table, flipping through the brittle pages. The strange symbols and cryptic notes seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, the faded ink somehow too vivid. He finally looked up at Sarah, his face pale. "We needed to know more, and now we do. Whoever wrote this, they were trying to contain something, or maybe summon it." Sarah's stomach turned at the thought. "Summon what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "I don't know. But these symbols, the rituals, they're not random. They're part of something bigger. And I think Evelyn was involved." "Evelyn?" Sarah repeated, feeling a chill run down her spine. "You think she what?" "She did all this. Or maybe she was trying to stop it," Jake said, his voice firm. "That photo, the way she's standing there, it's like she knew. Like she was trying to leave a message for someone to find." Sarah didn't know what to say. She felt like they were spiraling deeper and deeper into something they didn't understand, something they weren't meant to understand. "We should take it all back," she said finally. "The book, the photo, the box, everything. We need to put it all back where we found it and walk away." Jake frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. And if that doesn't stop it, if putting it back doesn't fix whatever we've started, then we call someone, Sarah said firmly. I don't know who, but someone. We can't do this alone, Jake. Before he could respond, the lights in the kitchen flickered. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the overhead bulbs as they dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. Max let out a low growl from under the table, his ears pinned back. A strange, cold breeze seemed to sweep through the room, even though all the windows were closed. Jake, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. What's happening? Jake stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. I don't know, he said, his voice tense. But we need to stay calm. The flickering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the room in an eerie stillness. But before they could even begin to process what had happened, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. It was heavy and deliberate, like something or someone had fallen or been dropped. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at Jake. That sounded like it came from our room, she said, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, his face pale. Stay here, he said, grabbing a flashlight from the counter. Jake, no, Sarah protested, grabbing his arm. We don't know what's up there. What if it's dangerous? I can't just ignore it, Jake said, his voice firm. I'll check it out. Stay here with Max. Reluctantly, Sarah let him go, her stomach churning with fear. She watched as he made his way up the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing through the silent house. Max whined softly, pressing against her leg as she stood frozen in the kitchen. Jake reached the top of the stairs and shone the flashlight down the hallway. Everything looked normal at first, but the thud had been so loud, so unmistakable. He approached their bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, just as they'd left it. The bed was unmade, and clothes were scattered across the chair in the corner. But something felt off. The air was colder here, and the faint metallic scent they'd noticed at the coffin seemed to linger. As Jake stepped further into the room, his flashlight caught something on the floor, a small object that hadn't been there before. He crouched down to get a closer look and felt his blood run cold. It was the pocket watch from the silver box, the cracked face glinting in the beam of light. He picked it up carefully, his hands trembling. Jake? Sarah's voice called softly from downstairs, her tone filled with worry. What's going on? He didn't answer right away, his mind racing. How had the watch gotten here? They'd rewrapped everything and left it in the coffin, or at least they thought they had. He stood up, gripping the watch tightly, and turned to leave the room. But as he did, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. Sarah screamed from downstairs, and Jake threw himself against the door, trying to open it. It wouldn't budge, as if something or someone was holding it closed. The flashlight flickered in his hand, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. Jake! Sarah's voice was frantic now. He could hear her pounding up the stairs, her footsteps quick and desperate. I'm here, he shouted, his voice muffled by the thick door. I can't get out. The flashlight flickered back on, and Jake's heart stopped. Standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She wore a simple dress, the fabric worn and faded, and her expression was one of sorrow and anger. Evelyn? Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at him, her gaze piercing and unrelenting. The room grew colder, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Sarah's voice broke through the silence, calling his name as she pounded on the other side of the door. Jake, open the door, please. Jake tore his eyes away from the figure and threw himself against the door again. This time, it gave way, nearly sending him tumbling into the hallway. Sarah caught him, her eyes wide with fear as she looked past him into the room. What happened? She asked, her voice shaking. Are you okay? Jake turned back to the room, but it was empty. The figure was gone, and the cold, oppressive air had lifted. He looked down at the pocket watch still clutched in his hand, his mind racing. We're not safe here, he said finally, his voice low and firm. We need to leave. Now. Sarah didn't argue. She grabbed Max, and the three of them rushed out of the house, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. But even as they drove away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. Whatever they had uncovered, whatever they had awakened, it wasn't finished with them yet. The road stretched out ahead of them, the silence in the car heavy and tense. Sarah clutched Max tightly in her lap, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur for comfort. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he stared straight ahead. Neither of them spoke, the events of the last hour weighing down on them like a physical force. "What now, Jake?" Sarah finally whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely audible, as if she was afraid of what the answer might be. Jake didn't reply right away. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The figure in the room, the watch appearing out of nowhere, the symbols, they were all connected somehow, but the pieces didn't fit together. "Not yet. We need to figure out what we're dealing with," he said at last, his voice low and steady. "This isn't random, Sarah. Someone, or something, wants us to know something. And until we understand what it is, we can't stop it." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "How can you say that? Jake, we've already gone too far. Whatever this is, it's dangerous. We should be running away, not trying to figure it out." Jake glanced at her, his expression resolute. "If we run, it'll follow us. You felt it too, didn't you? Whatever's happening, it's not just tied to the house. It's tied to us now." Sarah's stomach churned at his words. Deep down, she knew he was right. The eerie presence, the strange occurrences, they felt personal, like they were being watched, tested. But the thought of facing it head-on terrified her. Before she could respond, the car's headlights flickered. Jake frowned, tapping the dashboard. "What the?" he muttered, but the lights dimmed again, this time accompanied by a strange noise. It was a low, rhythmic hum, barely audible at first, but growing louder. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the air. Suddenly, the car sputtered, and the engine cut out, leaving them coasting to a stop on the side of the road. Jake swore under his breath, turning the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to start. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and Max let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. "Jake, what's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. "I don't know," he said, his voice tense. "But we need to stay calm." Before he could say anything else, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, their breath shallow. Then, out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. At first, it was hard to make out any details, but as their eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and shadowed. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the fabric worn and frayed, and his eyes seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Max tighter. Jake didn't answer. His hand instinctively reached for the pocket watch, which he had placed in his jacket. As soon as his fingers brushed against it, a sharp, piercing pain shot through his head, causing him to wince. The man in the road began to move, his steps slow and deliberate. Jake's grip on the watch tightened, the pain intensifying with each step the man took. It was as if the two were connected, the watch reacting to the presence of the figure. "Jake, we need to go," Sarah said urgently, her voice trembling. "I can't start the car," Jake replied through gritted teeth. "And we can't run. Not with him there." The man stopped a few feet from the car, his eyes fixed on Jake. He raised a hand slowly, pointing directly at him. Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine, the air around them seeming to freeze. "What do you want?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying Jake, and then pointed to the pocket watch. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering over his jacket. "Don't, Jake," Sarah pleaded. "Don't give it to him." But Jake couldn't ignore the pull he felt. It was as if the watch was compelling him, drawing him toward the figure. He reached into his jacket and held it up, the cracked face catching the moonlight. The man's expression didn't change, but the air around them seemed to shift. The hum returned, louder this time, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. Max barked frantically, jumping onto Sarah's lap, but she was too frozen with fear to comfort him. "Jake, stop!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. The watch began to glow faintly, the light pulsing in time with the hum. The man took another step forward, his outstretched hand beckoning. Suddenly, the light from the watch flared, blindingly bright. Jake cried out, dropping it onto the dashboard as the car shook violently. Sarah shielded her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The hum, the light, the trembling ground, it all vanished, leaving them in an eerie stillness. Jake and Sarah blinked, their vision adjusting to the darkness once again. The man was gone. "Where did he go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the pocket watch, which now lay on the dashboard, its face completely intact. The crack was gone, the metal polished and gleaming as if it were brand new. "What just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jake picked up the watch carefully, turning it over in his hands. "I don't know," he said, his voice hollow. "But I think this was only the beginning." As they sat in the car, the silence pressing down on them once more, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. And whatever they had awakened was far from finished with them. The car sat still on the side of the road, the only sound coming from the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Jake and Sarah stayed frozen in their seats, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Max whined softly in Sarah's lap, his body trembling as he tucked his head under her arm. It felt like time had stopped, like the world outside had shifted into something unrecognizable. Jake finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "I don't think we're safe yet." He stared at the pocket watch in his hand, its pristine surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. It felt warm, almost alive, as if the events of the last few minutes had charged it with something otherworldly. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "Jake, please. We have to get rid of it. This thing, it's not meant to be with us." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "Whatever's happening, we're in way over our heads." Jake wanted to agree, but something in the back of his mind held him back. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was curiosity. That strange, magnetic pull he felt toward the watch refused to let go. He knew Sarah was right. Keeping it was dangerous, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't reached the end of the mystery. "We can't just throw it away," Jake said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "It's connected to everything that's happened. If we leave it out here, what if someone else finds it? What if," he trailed off, the possibilities too unsettling to finish. Sarah wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Then what do we do? Because we can't keep living like this, Jake. The shadows, the noises, the man. It's too much." Jake thought for a moment, turning the watch over in his hands. The memory of the figure on the road flashed in his mind. The way he had pointed at the watch, almost like he was giving them a warning. Or maybe a command. "We go back," Jake said, his words surprising even himself. Sarah's eyes widened. "What? No, Jake, we can't. You saw what happened when we were there. It's not safe. We barely made it out the first time." Jake met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I think that's the point. This all started there, at the coffin, at Evelyn's grave. I think the only way to end it is to go back, to put everything back where it belongs." Sarah's lips trembled as she stared at him. She wanted to argue, to tell him how insane it sounded, but deep down, she knew he was right. The pull wasn't just on Jake, it was on her too. The answers, whatever they were waiting for them at the cemetery. The drive back was silent, the atmosphere heavy with dread. Even Max seemed to sense the weight of what was happening, staying curled up quietly in the back seat. The winding road seemed longer this time, the shadows stretching further as the night grew darker. When they finally reached the cemetery gates, the air felt colder, heavier, like it was holding its breath in anticipation. Jake parked the car, and they sat for a moment, neither of them moving. Sarah's hands gripped the edges of her seat, her knuckles white. "Are we really doing this?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "We have to." They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under their feet breaking the eerie silence. Max followed reluctantly, his tail low and his ears pinned back. They made their way through the rows of gravestones, the beam of Jake's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The path felt familiar now, every step bringing them closer to the coffin they had disturbed. When they reached it, the sight stopped them in their tracks. The coffin, which they had left closed, was now slightly ajar. The silver box they had taken was sitting on top, its lid open. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and Max let out a low growl. What does this mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake stepped closer, his hands trembling as he placed the pocket watch back into the silver box. As soon as he did, the air around them seemed to shift. A soft breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of something floral, like lavender. And then they saw her. Evelyn. She stood a few feet away, her figure faint and translucent, like a reflection in water. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, locked onto Jake and Sarah. She raised a hand slowly, pointing to the box. Jake felt his heart race as he looked at her, the weight of the moment overwhelming. "I think she's telling us to close it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his throat tight. He reached for the lid of the silver box and carefully closed it. The moment the lid clicked shut, Evelyn's figure began to fade. The air grew warmer, lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had surrounded them lifted. Evelyn's expression softened into a faint smile before she disappeared completely. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence of the cemetery felt different now, calm, almost peaceful. "She's gone," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with relief and sadness. Do you think she's at peace now?" Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on the coffin. "I think so. I think this was her way of asking for help. And we gave it to her." They stood there for a while, letting the weight of the experience settle. Eventually, they made their way back to the car, the sense of dread replaced by a quiet calm. Max trotted beside them, his tail wagging slightly, as if he too felt the change. The drive home was different. The tension that had hung over them for days was gone, replaced by a sense of closure. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was comfortable now, filled with unspoken understanding. When they pulled into their driveway, the house felt warm and welcoming again. The shadows in the corners no longer felt menacing, and the air inside was light. Max bounded into the living room, wagging his tail as he settled into his favorite spot under the table. As they sat on the couch, Sarah looked at Jake, a small smile on her lips. "So, no more adventures like that, okay?" she said, her tone light but sincere. Jake chuckled, a genuine laugh that felt good after everything they'd been through. "Deal," he said. "I think I've had enough excitement to last a lifetime." They sat together in silence, the events of the past few days feeling like a distant memory. The answers they had found hadn't been easy, but they had brought a sense of peace, not just for Evelyn, but for themselves as well. As the night settled in, Jake and Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew one thing for certain. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, not ignored. And sometimes, in facing the unknown, you find a strength you didn't know you had.